legislative issues provided by Literacy Action Network, our legislative committee, and I am ABE. And we are going to be talking today about some of the funding issues that affect ABE and how those might play out in the future. So we hopefully by the end of this webinar, if you don't know now, you'll have a better understanding of how ABE is funded so that over time we can advocate for increased funding. I'd like to introduce the other people who will be presenting on the webinar today. I'll be ducking back in at the end to say goodbye and to also lead a short discussion of questions and comments and so on. So Kaya Bergen from Neighborhood House, Chris Kloss from St. Paul ABE at the Hub Center are going to be our main presenters. And then Jody Frisaw from MDE will be providing backup if people have very technical questions that might be beyond our collective ability to answer. So I will now turn the webinar over to Kaya and Chris and Jody.
All right, hi everybody, this is Kaya. Thanks for joining all of us. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about a history of funding in ABE in Minnesota, as well as how we structure the distribution of funding for adult basic education. For some of you, this might be really familiar. For some of you, it might be new information. Our goal with it is that when we go into some more specific scenarios, everybody has the same base knowledge. So if you already know some of this, that's fantastic. And if you are brand new to funding ABE in Minnesota, that's also great. We're going to start out by talking about the structure of adult basic education in Minnesota. It's a little bit unique. We have a series of consortia. So we divide the state up into 41 different groups. And roughly speaking, the way that those groups are formed are in three categories. You can see there's a lot of exceptions to this. We're a really diverse state for adult basic education, but broadly speaking, the three groups that we have are district-based consortia, which are comprised of school districts, community-based organizations, and county correctional facilities, with the school district operating as the fiscal agent for that consortium. The other category would be a community-based organization, we'll call them CBOs, and they would not be affiliated with a school district. And then the final one is state corrections, which is its own sort of unique situation. And so using these different consortia, we then are able to divide the total funding for adult basic education. And that's different than a lot of states. In a lot of states, organizations and schools are competing individually for funding. And we'll look at how using this consortium model affects the funding in Minnesota. So some examples of what these consortia might look like. Our goal is that you are able to maybe identify which one you're in. When we look at large metro consortia, we're thinking about places like St. Paul and Minneapolis. These are typically pretty large in terms of their participants. You can see there's 4,000 to 6,000 from the 2018 to 2019 participants. Both of these have school districts as their fiscal agent, and then within those consortium, there are also community-based organizations that are part of those groups. When we think about smaller Greater Rural Minnesota consortia, we can see some examples like Detroit Lakes, Northwest Service Cooperative, Moorhead Consortium. These are typically smaller than a metro-based consortium, but a lot of them are still managed through school districts. They usually contain multiple school districts, and you can see in cases like Detroit Lakes, these are also, they also have county corrections in them. And significantly smaller in terms of participant numbers, but they can vary widely. So if we're looking at Detroit Lakes, there's like 100 participants up to almost 300. And then finally, when we're thinking about community-based organizations, these are things like Think Self, which was formerly FABE, and American Indian OIC. And these are individual community organizations, so they tend to have a smaller participant base, but again, you can see there's a wide range, and they are not affiliated with a school district. Finally, we have the state corrections, which makes up 9 correctional facilities. It's got a very large participant base. You can see it's about the same size as the metro district-based organizations we were looking at. So just to see kind of who we have on the call right now, we'd like to put up a poll and see if you can identify where you are in these different types of consortium. I'll give you a minute to read through it and answer. All right, and then I think Susan, if you're in control of that, if we could see some of the results. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you everybody for your responses. Looks like we've got a lot of people who are in Metro District-based consortia. We've got some folks from Greater Rural Minnesota, yay! Some CBOs, grid corrections, and other. We are going to look at what this means for each of your different situations and how these work together now, by talking about how what the main sources of funding are for adult basic education. Okay. There we go. All right. There we are. All right. So apologies for that. Funding in adult basic education comes from 2 main sources. The first one is federal. This is based on contact hours. So you may have heard a lot about contact hours. That's like the time that you're in the classroom with students. And there's a federal contact hour rate that's set every year. We're going to put up another poll right now. We'll give you a little bit less time for this one. Just go with your gut instinct. Tell us what you think the federal contact hour rate is for this year. Okay, we'll give you a couple more seconds to respond before we put up responses. All right, let's see what we guessed. All right, so it looks like we've got a tie between about $7.30 and 72 cents. So I appreciate that you guys kind of split the vote on that one. So the answer to it is that the federal contact rate is 72 cents. Whoop. A little bit of a surprise there. Wait for it. So we get about 72 cents from the federal government, and then we also get funding from the state of Minnesota. So this funding is not purely based on contact hours. Part of it also comes from, well, all of it comes through a funding formula that we're going to look at more in depth in the next slides. But contact hours do make up a part of what we get from the state of Minnesota. So now for our final poll, and if you were really paying attention, you've already got the answer to this, but tell us, what do you think the state contact hour rate is? All right, let's see what the answers are. Hey, excellent job. It's good. We've got fast learners on this webinar.
Somebody printed their worksheet ahead of time.
That's right. So yeah, the state of Minnesota has a contact hour rate of $7.30 for this upcoming year. So you can see there's a pretty big difference in how we're funded at a federal level and a state level. And I think that's important for us to pay attention to while we're thinking about funding for a couple of different reasons. One is that we're really fortunate to be in Minnesota. And so I think it's good as we continue to advocate for improvements in adult education, it's good to recognize how far we've come as well. There are states like Texas that are running their programs on just the federal contact hour rate, and you can imagine the limitations if you're just getting that 72 cents. So we are fortunate that the state of Minnesota invests as much as it does. As you saw, part of the goal in this presentation is to think about other ways that we can increase funding, because we believe that we can continue to do more. But the contact hour rate isn't the only part of how we fund distribute Minnesota's state funding. So it's all based on a funding formula. And what you're looking at here is a rough graph of how we divide up the lump sum of money that we get from the state government each year. So back in 1999 to 2000, there was a group of different people involved in adult basic education and community education who worked together to create the funding formula that we're going to look at. And the goal with the funding formula was to create a distribution of funds that really recognized the diversity of programs that we have in Minnesota. So we looked already at how we've got all of these different sizes, these different populations. We've got things affiliated with school districts. We've got organizations that are operating independently. And how do we create a distribution model that's going to address all of that? And the funding formula is what came out of that discussion. So the way that it works is that in addition to the contact hour aid, before we get any of that, we have to look at something called base aid. Base aid is made up of 3 different things. The first is that if you are in a school district, then you will get money based on the total population within your area, your consortiums. $1.73 per person. That's based on census data. So census is coming up, another reason to get an accurate census count. Then in addition to that, 8% of the remaining money will be distributed based on the number of limited English proficiency students that it's calculated are in that school district area. That's using information that you get from the school district fiscal agent. And then finally, another 8% is based on the number of adults who are over 25 without a secondary credential, so without something like a high school diploma. And then after that money has been distributed, the remaining 84% is divided up based on contact hours using the rates that we looked at in the other slide. This is kind of a complicated formula, so we are going to be doing some scenarios that are designed to give you the opportunity to see how all of these different things work. But in some, there's about the numbers that are up here, I won't read them all off to you. Federal funding and state funding, that gets divided among total consortia. And one of the takeaways that we want to have as we jump into these scenarios is that these numbers don't change. So if your contact hours are up, you'll get some more of that funding. If you've got a larger population, you will as well. But ultimately, what we need to do is increase these fundings to increase funding for the entire state of Minnesota.
Yeah, somebody recently was describing it like a pizza, and the pizza keeps staying the same size, but we keep trying to, and we can adjust how many slices we're cutting it into based on how many contact hours. But if the pizza doesn't get any bigger, eventually we're starting to make smaller and smaller slices, even if we keep getting more contact hours. And nobody wants a small slice of pizza. No, we don't want that. Okay. So here's where we're going to kind of unpack some of this information. This is Kristen, by the way, if you notice the change in voice. And so hopefully it looks like most of you printed that worksheet because you knew the answers to those poll questions right away. That's fantastic. So we're going to walk through these scenarios, and you can record the information as we go in that worksheet, and that just helps keep everyone engaged in the webinar. I know it can be a little hard to stay awake sometimes when you're sitting alone in a room staring at your laptop, but also just to help you kind of walk away with your understanding. So here we go. The first thing.
Kaya, can I interrupt for just 1 second?
Yes.
There was a question in the text chat that maybe we should address before we move ahead.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Let's do that.
Becca had asked, what about corrections? Do they get base aid?
Oh yeah, and I see Jody did answer that. And Jody, do you want to talk, or should we go ahead and read that out?
This is Jody. I'm here together with my colleague Brad Hatkamp. So, yep, that was a good question. And what I put in the chat is that corrections just received contact hour aid.
Okay. So as we're going forward with the scenarios, that's going to look very similar to when we do a scenario for a CBO. Thank you for that question. Okay, so
just 1 second, Chris and Kaya. Let me add one. Brad just reminded me of one small detail that I should clarify. The Department of Corrections, the ABE Consortium, only receives contact hour aid. There are also, in some cases, county correctional facilities that are part of other consortia that are school district-based consortia. Mm-hmm. So those school district-based consortia would get all 4 areas of the aid, but the DOC just gets contact hour aid.
And then, Jody, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's at the discretion of the school district that's receiving the aid as to whether or not they're distributing that base aid to something like county corrections, right?
Correct. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Yep. Thank you for helping with that. And Susan, thank you for alerting us. When we're going through the slides, it's hard to keep track of if there's a question in the chat. So thank you. Okay, so here we go. We're going to spin this wheel and select which scenario we're going to unpack first. So here we go. And this one is our large metro district-based consortium. So on your worksheet, we're looking at round 1, that first column for our general examples, and then the first row, the metro district-based consortium. So as Kaya mentioned, we have 2 kinds of funding, federal and state. So looking at the federal funding first, this consortium has generated 557,000 contact hours. And so multiplying that by that 72 cents, we should get about $412,000. So that's, you can record that in the worksheet.
And these are rounded numbers, so none of these are specific to one metro district or one of the community-based organizations, but rather are designed to be representative of, if you're in one of these, what are you kind of looking at generally for funding? And obviously it changes every year, but these are ballpark numbers.
Yeah, thank you. And then as far as state reimbursement, here we've got 560,000 contact hours generated. And if you notice, the number of contact hours between the federal and the state are different. And the reason that that is because what counts for federal contact hours and what counts for state contact hours is a little different. So the federal contact hours don't count things like GED testing. So if your school district site tests students on the GED, you have a testing site, you can count those testing hours towards your contact hours, but they're not going to reimburse it for the federal reimbursement. So our state contact hours have generated 4,088,000. And then now we're going to look at the base aid. So this is also part of the state funding. This example metro district has 720,000 for the census. That's just the number of people that live in this district, generating this number. And then the limited English proficiency reimbursement is 400,000, and people over 25 with no diploma is another 300,000. So that's a total of $1,420,000 that are being generated just for base aid. So then we'll total those together, and their total state reimbursement is $5,508,000. We're going to look at another scenario. We'll spin the wheel, and we're going to take a look at greater Minnesota, more rural district. Next. So again, looking at federal funding first, we've got 8,800 contact hours, and multiply that by the contact hour rate, that generates about $6,000 for their program. Well, here we go. So for the state contact hours, they've got the same number. So in this example, this district doesn't have a GED testing site, so they're generating the same number of contact hours that count for federal and state. That gives them $64,000 for the contact hour reimbursement, and then their base aid, you can see their census number, their LEP number, and their no diploma number. So if we total those together, that's $230,000. But there's a little more to it. So this $230,000, if you were to divide that by the number of contact hours, you're going to get somewhere around, I think it was $26. And there is a, correct me if I say this wrong, Jody, it's part of state statute that the contact hour rate can't be more than $22 an hour. So if you take that total reimbursement rate and divide it by the number of contact hours, that can't equal more than $22. And so this program is not going to be able to be reimbursed that full amount. Instead, they can only be reimbursed $22 per contact hour, which changes the rate to $193,000. They have to not really return $37,000, but the $37,000 that would have been generated is not going to be.
The idea behind that, really quickly, as I understand it, is that it's a question of if you have a large enough population that you're receiving that base aid, but you're not actually generating contact hours as it relates to them, then the idea on having that cap is that you're not getting a disproportionately large amount of base aid for services that you're not connecting with people who are living in that area, which is part of this idea of the balance in the funding formula of addressing all the different kinds of consortia that we have.
Yes, thank you for that. All right, and we're going to look at one more. So here's our wheel, and this time we're going to look at a community-based organization-based consortium. So here's our federal funding. We've got 9,200 contact hours, and that generates about $7,000. For the state funding, they've got 9,600, so this would be another example. Maybe they've got a GED testing site, and then they've generated $70,000 just through contact hours alone. If we look at the base aid then, here, community-based organizations are not eligible for base aid, and so they're generating $0 for this. keeping their total at $70,000 of state funding.
And for community-based organizations that are part of a metro district-based consortium, so for example, if you're part of like Minneapolis and you're a community organization, but your fiscal agent is Minneapolis Public Schools, then it's at the discretion of the fiscal agent as to whether or not the base aid is distributed. At this time, I don't think any of the districts distribute base aid to the community-based organizations that are a part of their consortium.
Yeah, not that I know of. And it would be, yeah, the consortium would be the ones to make that decision. And so it would be based on the consortium's guidelines. Okay, so this next part is where on your worksheet, we're going to look at round 2 and round 3. In these two, we're not really going to look at that federal contact hour reimbursement just because what we really want to do is spend some time unpacking how this state funding formula works. And I like to call this, let's break it and see what happens. So we're going to have some sort of disastrous scenarios to sort of demonstrate what's really happening with the funding formula. So here we go. Our first disaster is a tornado which has completely destroyed the metro area and has caused a reduction of 8,000 hours. Schools were closed, they had to rebuild, students weren't able to get to school. Many of you might think this sounds like last winter with the snowfall. And so let's see what happens. So here we've got this metro district. We've reduced their contact hours to 552,000, still multiplying it by that state reimbursement rate, and you have their total there. Their base aid stays the same because those are all based on population, but they are generating about $58,000 less in this fiscal year, giving them this new total here. This Metro CBO is also going to lose that 8,000 hours. So now they're down to about 1,600 hours, and multiplied by their contact hour rate, you've got $12,000. They're also losing about 58,000, but they're not eligible for base aid. And so here their total reimbursement for this program year is going to be $12,000. And then finally, the program in Greater Minnesota, they didn't suffer a tornado, and so their totals stay the same. You can see again they generated the $230,000, but because they're hitting that cap, they're reduced by 37, and they have the same total again. And what it sounded like you were saying earlier, Jody, is that the state correctional facilities would be similar. If they, for some reason, lost a significant number of contact hours, they're not getting that base aid that helps stabilize, and so they would, their hours would drop as well.
Yeah, this is Jody. So yeah, I can confirm that if the correctional, if DOC as a ABE consortium, if they had a lot fewer hours from one year compared to the previous year, then yeah, their funding would certainly go down.
Didn't this year.
Right, although so one kind of additional factor though is that contact hour rate does vary a little year over year, and if overall, if the whole system has fewer contact hours, then the rate itself may go up. So that's just an additional sort of complicating factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to look at another scenario. this time we've had a significant population shift. So as you saw, I don't know, it was a cow or some sort of significant event happened, and 7,000 people have moved from greater Minnesota towards the metro regions. So let's see how this impacts funding. So here, that greater Minnesota program has still generated the same number of contact hours, 8,800. They must really be working hard. Their participants are really coming to class a lot. So they've got 64,000 in contact hours. But their base aid has been affected. So it's been reduced by $23,000 because of the population shift. Now, in this particular example, the total then is $207,000, but they're still above that $22 an hour cap. And so they're still going to be reduced by $14,000 and generate the same number of funding total. The Metro District has generated $552,000 for that same amount of total contact hour reimbursement, but their base aid is going up because the population shift happened. So now they've got $23,000 more in their base aid. And then finally, we've got our CBO. They're generating about 9,600 contact hours. Their base aid hasn't changed, even though they might be serving a similar population. Maybe they have a lot of new participants, but they don't receive that base aid, so that hasn't impacted their total amount of funding. And they're still at 70,000. Okay, so what we want to do now, is have some time to discuss some questions. And I think, let me look at how many people we have in the webinar at the moment. We have quite a few. Susan, do you want to break us into groups so that people can discuss together?
Sure, give me just a second to set that up.
Yeah, I'm going to talk while you're doing that. So what should happen when she breaks you into groups is that these questions for discussion will remain on your screen, and you will be in a closed group with a number of other people on the webinar. So you can unmute yourself, turn your microphone on, and then you can discuss. And we'll give you a certain amount of time, and then we'll bring everyone back to
Tom, wrap up with the last few slides, and then I think we're going to be done for the day.
So we wanted to take a few moments just to talk about your thoughts and takeaways for the training. Go on to the next slide. So before we talk about our next events, does anybody have anything they would like to share about what they learned, questions they might still have, or other thoughts they'd like to share with people in the webinar? You can either speak or you can send a text, which we can read. Anyway, before we conclude, just want to run over a couple of next steps. First of all, please put on your calendar Day on the Hill, which is Monday, February 9th of next year. And we will be getting a lot more details out in the near future. This is for both students and staff. We don't know yet whether we'll have any legislation introduced this year that will affect ABE, though my suspicion is there probably will be. So this is at a good time in the session to be able to have some influence on what happens. The planning meeting for this event is January 13th at 3 p.m. at the Literacy Council, and that will be a face-to-face meeting. So we would encourage anybody that is interested in coming and helping us plan this event to do so. And finally, we will have the next webinar in this series, which we're doing every other month at 2:45 p.m. on February 10th.
Do you happen to know what the topic is for the next
I do not, because I did not schedule that. It will be a legislative issue. My guess is that probably we will be talking specifically about our platform and reviewing any legislation that has been introduced or will be introduced that affects ABE. So I'd like to conclude by really thanking everybody for participating. And I know some people had various little technical glitches, so thank you for your patience with yourselves and each other and all of us as we try to communicate from a number of different locations. Mm-hmm. And please contact us at either of the addresses on the screen if you have further questions or comments or things you'd like us to consider. So I think with that, we will conclude the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. And